taking reparations as an issue. Not only were you writing in these magazines and papers, but you also went to the United States House Judiciary in June 2019 to argue Bill H.R. 40 to argue against reparations. So maybe for my listeners, what's the story in America over reparations? What's the debate? And since 2019, how have things developed?
So my position, it's not exactly right to say it was against reparations, full stop, because I believe in paying reparations to living victims of any government-sponsored atrocity, right? Living victims of the Holocaust. Many got reparations. I support that. So my position was actually that living victims of segregation and the Jim Crow system in the South, which we all now view as one of the great moral stains of our history. Some, like my grandparents, for instance, grew up under segregation in D.C. It would make perfect sense to pay them reparations for having grown up in an apartheid system that we now look back on with horror. To give someone like me reparations for being 6 generations removed from slaves, that makes no sense. And there's no precedent for that in the history of reparations. Like once you miss the victims themselves or their children, I'm unaware of any serious precedent, much less a pattern of states finding the 6th great grandchild of someone and cutting them a check in order to atone for the suffering visited upon their great grandparent. And the truth is, the taboo truth is that the link between something awful that happens to me and that being that vibration being felt by my great grandson, that link is not at all clear. Causation and the way people's lives change in a single generation. There's no reason to believe actually that I am materially harmed. There's no way to know, I would say, that I'm materially harmed by the fact that my great grand parents were slaves. And that's in no way to minimize the enormous moral horror of slavery. It's just to say, I don't think that most Black Americans are under the age of 40, under the age of 35 even. So that's the case I was really arguing against. And
what's the if you were to strongman the position for reparations, how would you articulate that?
Okay, well, if I were to steelman the position in favor of reparations, I would say, well, in the first place, we've paid reparations many times before to many other groups, Japanese Americans, obviously Holocaust survivors, and the sum of crimes against Black Americans from slavery and Jim Crow have created a circumstance where Black Americans, on the whole, are less wealthy than they would have been had they not experienced those government-sponsored crimes, essentially. So it is up to the government to restore Black Americans to where they would be but for slavery, but for Jim Crow, and reparations is the way to do that.
So actually, where you would probably, it sounds like you'd agree, is that there are communities in America who are the descendants of slaves who remain, and those communities remain poor communities, and that where they are economically is partly because of their history. And so that's a problem that America needs to deal with, generally speaking. And you would, I imagine you would agree that yes, whoever it is who's suffering left behind, there should be, perhaps, or maybe you wouldn't, but maybe there should be government action, but it shouldn't be in the form of reparations.
I actually would not agree with the first statement. So the problem of intergenerational poverty in America, I view as a very complicated and independent problem. I don't think that you can say slavery and Jim Crow are the reason why there are, you know, X percent, maybe 20%, whatever the poverty rate is currently in the black community, that's why it is. You know, every black person who's poor is poor because of slavery and Jim Crow. I mean, I do not believe that at all. I think um, every single human being, every single American has a story of why they're situated where they are situated. That has a lot to do with themselves and their parents. Has a lot to do with the hands that their parents were dealt. But every story, I mean, just think of any friend that you have who has a rags to riches story, or something like the opposite, a kind of backsliding into the middle class story, and how complicated any given one of those stories is. Not even a single one of those stories can be reduced to a single historical event from the 20th century, much less the 19th and 18th centuries. So to say that uh, black people in America, poor black people in the hood in America today, are there because of slavery and Jim Crow, that is a fashionable but completely
Sorry,
simplistic
that's not
BS
what I'm
analysis of the
proposing, though.
problem, in my view.
More, I'm saying
Yeah.
that it's one of the reasons might be that historically they come from that horrible background. That not I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it might be one of, let's say, 100 reasons why.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, totally. I would totally
Mm.
grant that.
Yeah, I mean, so, sort of with you. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and the idea that I would get reparations for what her family went through, it would it doesn't seem quite right to me. But I agree with you, and in that I think it was in the early 50s that Germany paid Israel reparations, and actually only last year, I think it was in March 2001, the Iraqi government initiated the Yazidi survivor law, where female and children survivors of the ISIS atrocities in northern Iraq were paid reparations, or are being paid reparations as a framework for them to be paid reparations for the suffering. But that ties in with your argument very much, that they are the direct sufferers of, they are the victims themselves rather than the progeny of them.
Yeah. An analogy I've made, I mean, as was true for the Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II, I would add.
Right.
Um, I I've made an analogy before, which is that when you meet someone say their parents had a really hard life, their parents were from poverty and struggle, but they themselves grew up with privilege. There are people in that position that sometimes try to assume the the struggle of their parents as their own identity, right? Like sort of try to claim the street cred of their parents when in fact they as an individual don't really have
Mm.
any. And I this has always come across as a kind of phony and a little bit insincere thing to do. I think most people sort of see through that kind of act as not the most honest way to have your identity. The honest way is to say, well, I grew up with a lot of privilege. My parents didn't, just to fully represent that reality rather than try to assume,
Mm.
right? Basically, what we are encouraging all of Black America to do with this reparations angle is to do that whole phony thing en masse, to assume the suffering of people that were actually slaves, people that actually did suffer, and take on that mantle as if we ourselves suffered it, which is a pathological thing to encourage people to do.
Well, this obviously is an idea that has a real stronghold in your peers if you felt so compelled to write the song Blasphemy, and presumably this is the blasphemy you're talking about, and it's an idea that's so strongly held that you were ostracized from your friend group. Or is that right? You have to believe the lyrics.
Over the years in New York, I've developed friend groups that are from very different walks of life. So the friend group that ostracized me was the Brooklyn underground hip hop community, which was mostly black, many of which came from poverty. But beyond either of those, the crucial variable is that they were basically their only concept of politics was pro-black politics, and so they saw me as going against pro-black politics, and that's extremely taboo in that circle. What I was saying may have been a controversial take in my other circles, but it wasn't necessarily a cancelable offense with most of my friends.
So is that Brooklyn hip hop scene a politicized scene? Is
Oh yeah.
And so what does that the sort of the pro-black politics that you describe? What is that? How would you describe it?
I would say it is roughly the political valence of Black Lives Matter. I'm not sure that they necessarily would like the Black Lives Matter global network, but it's pretty much like graft your stereotype of the politics of BLM, of a strong BLM supporter. That's kind of the center of the spectrum of that scene.